The topic is Malcolm X in New York. And of course, we're talking to Brother LLillard about Malcolm X in New York and some of the other experiences that you had. Why don't you continue your discussion and your first contact and your first meeting with Malcolm X?
Well, you know, Harlem was for a little Southern boy was an amazing happening just to be in Harlem, you know, and look at the legend and the history, the Renaissance of Harlem, which I didn't know a lot about, but I was, as an engineer, as a scientist, you don't read a lot of literature. So, but I began to realize I didn't know much about literature, or really about the Harlem Renaissance. So I was simultaneously being, you know, inundated with this whole new rhetoric from this man called Malcolm X. I was trying to catch up as a little Southern boy, not understanding the great writers that we had, you know, and I was castigating TSU's education. It just that we didn't have the breadth of the kind of famous folks. So I was beginning to read Ball and Claude McKay and all these incredible people I had never heard of. So you can imagine this little Southern boy trying to absorb and process all of this, you know. And there's Malcolm X. There's the Nation of Islam. This man's talking about the Honorable Elijah Muhammad has taught us that, the so-called Negro. I'm thinking, what is he talking about? Well, why didn't he talk like my ministers do? Why didn't he talk like Martin Luther King? And of course, about this time, it was time for the March on Washington. So in my section of Brooklyn, I'm getting involved, raising money, getting all the schools and all the daycare centers to get their buses aligned, and I'm being what I always do. I'm an organizer, I'm an engineer, I'm a layout man. I'm just busting my butt to make sure we have as many buses rolling out of my part of Brooklyn, which is East New York, right, and Bed-Stuy, to the March on Washington. And along about a month and a half before the March on Washington, Malcolm comes to us and say, why are you guys doing this? You're just little robots. They're going to tell you when to come into Washington, where to go in Washington, and when to leave. And that really made me mad, because I'm just working so hard to make this thing come about so we can prove to America that it's time for America to listen to us. And here this man saying, you're a fool, you're a chump, you've been had. And I'm having to weigh this. And at the same time, not wanting to feel like a dummy for working hard to make this happen, at the same time questioning what is the real purpose of this march. And at the last minute, I decided not to go. But I had to work all this time, raise all this money, and I'm glad I didn't, because one of my stalwarts peers here, John Lewis, who was at the March on Washington, made a major speech, was part of the SNCC leadership, was told by the Kennedy boys and the liberal whites in the union movement what to say. So Malcolm was right. Malcolm was absolutely right. And that's exactly what happened. And you know what happened 3 weeks after the March on Washington? You can't forget that. The Birmingham bombing.
Okay,
Folks don't forget those two things together. And those are the same things that Malcolm said. And so I had to reconsider whether or not civil rights was, at this point, should be a viable part of my everyday being. Was that my goal? Malcolm kept talking about, well, why do you need civil rights? Because I said, well, Malcolm, because we're Americans and we're black Americans and we need civil rights to correct all